Welcome back to the Golden Ancient Tales, the channel where forgotten empires rise again, ancient heroes breathe once more, and history's greatest turning points unfold before your eyes. Today, we journey into one of the most explosive events of the modern world, the Russian Revolution, a struggle that shattered an empire, dethroned a dynasty, and rewrote global politics forever. Before we begin this gripping tale filled with power, betrayal, suffering, and the unstoppable cry for change, don't forget to subscribe, like, and drop a comment below. Tell us which historical story you'd love us to bring to life next. Now, let us step into the storm that changed Russia forever. Russia at the dawn of the 20th century was a land of extremes. Towering cathedrals and endless wheat fields, glittering palaces and freezing wooden huts, unimaginable luxury woven directly into unimaginable suffering. For hundreds of years, the Romanov dynasty ruled this vast kingdom like a rigid spine holding together the frozen giant. But by the early 1900s, that spine had begun to crack. Slowly, quietly, fatally. At the very top stood Tsar Nicholas II, a gentle, soft-spoken man who genuinely loved his family and believed deeply in his sacred duty. But fate had placed the wrong man at the helm of a ship, heading straight toward a storm. Nicholas was raised to see the monarchy as unshakable, the people as obedient, and himself as the chosen guardian of Russia. But he was blind to the suffering spreading across the land, blind to the resentment building like steam in a sealed pot, and blind to the changes shaking the modern world. Russia itself was enormous, stretching across climates, ethnicities, and cultures. Yet inequality tied them all together like an iron chain. 80% of the population were peasants, trapped in a cycle of poverty from the moment they took their first breath. Most worked from sunrise to sunset, laboring on land they didn't own, planting crops that rarely put enough food on their own tables. Their huts were cold, cramped, and filled with smoke from the tiny fires they used to survive Russia's brutal winters. Many had never seen a doctor. Many didn't know how to read. But they all knew hunger, and they knew it well. In the cities, life wasn't much better. Industrialization had arrived late in Russia, and when it finally did, it hit with the force of a hammer. Factories sprang up in places like Petrograd and Moscow, swallowing thousands of workers each day. These workers lived in overcrowded tenements, where families squeezed into single rooms, sharing thin walls, creaking floors, and the smell of sweat, sickness, and exhaustion. Children worked alongside adults, and accidents were common. The lucky ones came home with bruises and broken fingers. The unlucky ones never came home at all. Yet, while the people suffered, the imperial family lived inside a world so gilded it seemed unreal. The Winter Palace, with its glittering chandeliers and halls lined with gold, was like another planet. Here, Nicholas and his wife Alexandra raised their children surrounded by servants, fine porcelain, and the constant assurance that God himself had placed them above every other Russian soul. The divide between palace and village was so wide, it was no longer just social. It was spiritual, emotional, and unbridgeable. And as Russia stepped into the 1900s, the world began to change faster than Nicholas could understand. Democratic ideas spread across Europe like wildfire. Workers in France, Germany, and Britain demanded rights. Empires loosened their grips on old traditions. But Russia clung desperately to the past. Every decision Nicholas made revealed his disconnect. When protests rose, he sent soldiers. When hunger spread, he ignored it. When his advisors begged for reform, he believed reform was a weakness. His belief in absolute power became not his strength, but his curse. Then came World War I, the spark that would turn Russia's problems into an inferno. Nicholas proudly marched Russia into the conflict, believing it would unite the nation behind him. Instead, the war peeled open every weakness like a wound. Soldiers went into battle without proper boots. Many lacked rifles. Some were told to wait until a fellow soldier died before picking up their weapon. Mothers waited months for letters that never came. The city starved as food supplies plummeted. The countryside was drained of men, leaving only women, children, and the elderly to work the fields. The Tsar tried to inspire his nation, but he could not feed them. He could not protect them. And worse, he could not adapt. His decisions became desperate, confused, even dangerous. As soldiers fell by the millions and the empire crumbled at the edges, The people began to whisper what had once been unthinkable. Maybe the Tsar is not chosen by God. Maybe he is the reason for our suffering. Maybe the Romanovs must fall. Russia had reached a breaking point. The tension in the air felt like the crack before thunder. Something old, ancient, sacred even, was dying, and from its corpse, something fierce and unpredictable was preparing to rise. The empire stood on the edge of a cliff. All it needed was one push. Winter had wrapped Petrograd in a grip, so cold it felt like the city itself might shatter. The streets were buried in snow. Chimneys poured out smoke that vanished instantly into the icy air, and the Neva River sat frozen solid like a sheet of white steel. But beneath this frozen silence, something dangerous was heating. Anger, hunger, and desperation. It was February 1917, and Russia was at its breaking point. Bread had become a luxury. Long lines formed outside bakeries long before sunrise. Wrapped in ragged coats and torn shawls, women waited for hours, often only to hear the same crushing words. No more bread. Mothers cried. Children fainted. The soldiers returned from the front brought stories of chaos, of friends died without weapons, of officers who didn't know what they were doing, and of a Tsar who seemed blind to the suffering of his people. Every day, Petrograd felt less like a city and more like a boiling pot. On the morning of February 23rd, thousands of women, tired of begging for food and watching their families starve, poured into the streets. They shouted, not in rebellion at first, but in desperation, "Bread, bread, we want bread." Yet these cries shook the city. The workers heard. The soldiers heard. The entire nation heard. Within hours, factory workers from the Putilov plant, the largest in Petrograd, joined the protests. Soon, tens of thousands marched through the streets. Flags rose. Shouts echoed between the cold stone buildings. A human wave surged through Petrograd, unstoppable and growing with every step. "What do we want?" someone shouted. "Bread." "And what else?" "An end to the war. Down with the Tsar." The demonstration spread like fire across dry grass. At first, the authorities thought it would pass. Protests happened before. They always fizzled out. But this time was different. This time, the people were done being afraid. The Tsar, from his distant command headquarters at the front, barely understood what was happening. Advisors told him to take action, strong action. Nicholas II sent an imperial order. Restore order. Immediately, soldiers marched into the city with rifles, their boots crunching through the snow. They were told to fire if necessary. The government believed force would end the chaos. It always had. But the unimaginable happened. As soldiers faced the massive crowds, something inside them broke. Many of these soldiers were peasants themselves, fresh in the trenches, exhausted, hungry, and furious at the Tsar who had sent them to die in a losing war. They looked at the protesters and saw not enemies, but their own families. When one commander shouted, "Fire at the crowds," the soldiers hesitated. Then one soldier lowered his rifle. Another followed. Then another. In moments, entire regiments switched sides, raising their rifles into the air and shouting, "We will not shoot our own people." Some soldiers even joined the protesters, handing out rifles to civilians. Others turned on their officers, refusing to follow orders. The unthinkable had happened. The Tsar's own army had defected. Now the protest was no longer a demonstration. It was a revolution. Petrograd spiraled into chaos. Police stations were stormed. Prison doors were thrown open. Crowds of workers and soldiers seized government buildings. Smoke rose across the skyline as the old symbols of imperial authority were torn down. When word reached Nicholas II, the Tsar was stunned. He believed his people loved him deeply, and that the protests were the work of a small, troublesome minority. But the reality was undeniable. His empire was collapsing. Panicking, he attempted to return to Petrograd by train to regain control. But it was too late. Railway workers refused to move the train. The tracks ahead were blocked. Everywhere he looked, loyalty to the monarchy had crumbled. Nicholas was trapped, not by enemies, but by his own nation. Members of the Duma, the Russian parliament, sent him a message urging him to abdicate for good of the country. Generals, once fiercely loyal, now admitted they could no longer fight for him. Even his own relatives believed the dynasty was doomed. On March 2nd, 1917, under overwhelming pressure, Tsar Nicholas II signed a document that ended more than 300 years of Romanov rule. It was over, just like that. The empire that once felt eternal had fallen in a matter of days. Crowds in Petrograd erupted into celebration. Workers cheered. Soldiers embraced. Women wept. Not because the struggle was over, but because they finally felt hope. But standing in the shadows of this triumph was uncertainty. Russia was free, yes, but free to become what? A new government rose quickly, calling itself the Provisional Government, promising democracy, rights, and peace. But peace would not come. Not yet. For while one storm had passed, another, far darker, far more powerful, was already forming beyond the horizon, and his name was Lenin. The collapse of the Romanov dynasty sent shockwaves through Russia and across Europe. The streets of Petrograd buzzed with excitement. Workers cheered. Soldiers shouted slogans of freedom, and newspapers announced the dawn of a new era. The Tsar was gone. The people had won. But beneath the celebration, confusion lingered like fog at dawn. Russia had removed its ruler. Yes, but it had not removed hunger. It had not ended the war. It had not dealt with the broken factories, the crumbling economy, or the millions of exhausted soldiers still bleeding on the front lines. Into this fragile silence stepped the Provisional Government, a loose collection of liberals, moderates, and intellectuals who promised to guide the nation toward democracy. They believed Russia needed time. Time to breathe, time to heal, time to choose its future through elections. But the people didn't want time. They wanted solutions, and they wanted them fast. Factories were still closed. The price of bread kept rising. Soldiers deserted the front in droves. Peasants seized land, fed up with waiting for permission. And every day, the war dragged on, swallowing lives like a hungry beast. Russia had removed its king, but it had not removed its suffering. And from across Europe, in Switzerland, one man watched all of this with sharp, calculating eye. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Lenin had been living in exile for years, banned from Russia for his revolutionary activities. He spent his days reading, writing, and sharpening ideas powerful enough to topple an empire. He believed the February Revolution was only the beginning. To him, the Provisional Government was a mistake, a weak, half-finished transition that still allowed the rich to dominate the poor. Lenin did not want reform. He wanted revolution, a complete restructuring of society from the ground up. When news of the Tsar's fall reached him, Lenin felt electricity shoot through his veins. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Russia was not stable. It was vulnerable, and in vulnerability, revolution thrives. But there was a problem. Russia was at war with Germany, and Lenin was in a country surrounded by German-controlled borders. How could he reach Petrograd? His solution was bold and controversial. Lenin negotiated with the German authorities to allow him to travel through their territory in a sealed train. Germany agreed, not out of kindness, but out of strategy. They wanted chaos in Russia. A destabilized Russia meant a weakened enemy in the war. And so, on a cold April day, Lenin boarded a dark green train with his closest supporters. The doors were sealed behind them. The windows were locked. Armed guards ensured no one left the compartments. To the world, this journey would become a legend, Lenin's sealed train. As the train rolled across Europe, Lenin drafted speeches, wrote plans, and imagined how he would reshape Russia. He believed that only the working class, the proletariat, should hold power. Not nobles, not generals, not landowners, only the workers. After days of travel, the train finally reached the Finland station in Petrograd. Thousands of supporters gathered to greet him. Red flags waved. Workers shouted his name. Soldiers raised their rifles in salute. Lenin stepped off the train with fire in his eyes. He climbed onto an armored car and delivered a speech that echoed to the crowd like thunder. His message was clear, sharp, and shocking. No support for the Provisional Government. End the war immediately. Peace, land, and bread. All power to the Soviets. The crowd erupted in applause. For the first time, they heard someone speak directly to their pain. Someone who didn't promise slow reforms or distant elections, but immediate change. The provisional government was stunned. They expected Lenin to support them in guiding Russia toward democracy. Instead, he declared them an obstacle, another enemy of the people. Within weeks, Lenin and the Bolsheviks rallied workers, soldiers, and peasants with unstoppable momentum. Their ideas spread through factories, trenches, and villages like wildfire. Meetings erupted across Petrograd. Bolshevik newspapers printed bold, radical messages. Soldiers marched under red banners. The poor began to see Lenin not as a politician, but as their champion. Yet not everyone welcomed his return. Moderates feared he would bring chaos. Liberals feared he would destroy democracy. The wealthy feared he would destroy them. But the greatest fear came from the provisional government, which now faced a dangerous truth. Lenin had returned not to participate, but to conquer, and his revolution was only just beginning. By the autumn of 1917, Petrograd felt like a city living on borrowed time. The air was cold, sharp, and metallic, carried on a wind that whistled through broken windows and empty stomachs. Factories groaned to a halt. Workers argued in the streets, and soldiers wandered the city with haunted eyes, unsure who exactly they still served. The provisional government, once greeted with hope, now seemed powerless. Its promises had faded like frost under morning light. The war continued. Hunger grew. Violence spilled across the countryside as peasants seized land, and soldiers deserted the front in desperate waves. People no longer whispered their frustrations. They shouted them. And in every angry gathering, one name rose louder than the rest. Lenin. Throughout the summer, Lenin had pushed the Bolsheviks to prepare for the inevitable. He believed the provisional government was too weak to survive the storm coming its way. "History will not forgive us," he wrote, "if we do not seize power now." But despite Lenin's fiery determination, many Bolshevik leaders hesitated. "We aren't strong enough," some argued. "The time isn't right." Lenin disagreed. To him, timing was not something you waited for. It was something you created. Then in October, he made his move, shaving his famously recognizable beard and disguising himself in a worker's cap and wig. Lenin secretly returned to Petrograd. It was a dangerous gamble. If he was caught, he would be arrested instantly, perhaps even executed. But desperation sharpened his courage. He slipped into the city like a shadow. Inside the Bolshevik headquarters at the Smolny Institute, a cold, echoing former girls' school, Lenin burst into a meeting of Bolshevik leaders. His eyes blazed with urgency. "The time for argument is over," he declared. "The people are ready. The soldiers are ready. Power must be taken now, tonight, if possible." His voice left no room for debate. Trotsky, brilliant and strategic, supported him. Under Trotsky's guidance, the Military Revolutionary Committee, MRC, had quietly been preparing for weeks, arming Red Guards, placing Bolshevik supporters in crucial positions, and securing loyalties among workers and soldiers. Now the pieces were ready. The revolution only needed a spark. As darkness swallowed Petrograd on October 25th, November 7th in the modern calendar, snowflakes fell like ash from a dying fire. Red Guards, workers armed with rifles and determination, moved silently through the streets. Their boots crunched lightly on the snow-covered ground as they fanned out across the city. Unlike the chaotic uprisings of February, this takeover was planned like a military operation. There were no loud speeches, no chaotic crowds, just quiet precision. One by one, strategic points of the city fell. The telephone exchange captured, the railway station secured, the state bank surrounded, bridges across the Neva blocked and controlled. The provisional government slept unaware, or perhaps unwilling to believe, that its end was slipping through the night like a silent tide. By dawn, Petrograd belonged to the Bolsheviks. Yet one final symbol of the old order still stood, the Winter Palace, where the provisional government had gathered, trembling but defiant. Hollywood would one day turn this moment into a violent spectacle of explosions, fire, and heroic charges. But history paints a very different picture. The Winter Palace was vast but nearly undefended. Inside were only a few cadets, a women's battalion, and exhausted officers. They were brave, but hopelessly outnumbered. Outside, the cruiser Aurora, stationed on the Neva, fired a single blank shot, a signal that echoed to the city like a thunderclap. It was not a shot of war. It was a shot of change. The Red Guards advanced. They did not rush. They walked, calmly, confidently, determined. There was no grand battle, no rivers of blood. Resistance collapsed almost immediately. By midnight, the Guards stormed the palace through back doors and side corridors, moving past glittering chandeliers and silent halls. They found members of the provisional government huddled around a table, exhausted and defeated. Without drama, without fight, they were arrested. At that moment, in that quiet palace room, the centuries-old dream of monarchy died. And something new, radical, unknown, and frightening, was born. Just hours later, Lenin stepped onto the platform at the Congress of Soviets. The delegates erupted into cheers as he raised his hand and declared, "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order." The October Revolution had succeeded. No single gun battle defined it. No grand spectacle marked it. It was a revolution carried out in silence, precision, and determination. But although the Bolsheviks now held the reins of power, they had no idea of the storms that awaited them. Storms of war, famine, betrayal, and transformation. For Russia had stepped into a new world, and there was no turning back. The Bolsheviks had taken power, but victory did not bring peace. Far from it. The October Revolution had opened a door, but behind that door waited a storm that would tear Russia apart. The country was too vast, too fractured, and too bruised by war to accept a single new master without resistance. As Lenin and his followers settled into their new roles, a single question echoed across the country like a war drum. Who truly controls Russia now? The answer depended on whom you asked. To the Bolsheviks, they were the saviors of the working class, the rightful leaders of a new socialist future. To their enemies, the nobles, generals, monarchists, landowners, and moderates, they were dangerous radicals who had seized power through deceit and manipulation. Russia had no consensus. Russia had only anger. And in this boiling atmosphere, the nation erupted into a conflict that would become one of the bloodiest civil wars of the 20th century. The Bolshevik forces, known as the Red Army, were commanded by the sharp, brilliant Leon Trotsky. He transformed scattered militias into a disciplined fighting force. He recruited workers, peasants, and soldiers who believed in the new order or who simply had no other choice. Trotsky traveled by armored train, rallying fighters, enforcing discipline, and inspiring loyalty wherever he went. Opposing them were the White Armies, an unpredictable, fractured alliance bound more by their hatred of Bolshevism than by any shared vision. They included former Tsarist generals, monarchists who wanted the Romanovs restored, liberals and moderates who wanted democracy, foreign powers like Britain, France, Japan, and even the United States, each with their own interests in Russian territory. The Whites were fierce but divided. Their leaders often argued, sabotaged each other's plans, and lacked a united command. Yet they held vast territories and were well armed by foreign governments. Between these two great forces were the people, trapped in the middle, trying to survive. No event symbolized the brutality of the Civil War more than the fate of the Romanov family. By 1918, the Bolsheviks had imprisoned Nicholas II, Empress Alexandra, and their 5 children in the city of Ekaterinburg. The Whites were advancing, and Lenin feared the family might be rescued and used as a symbol to rally anti-Bolshevik forces. So, in the dead of night on July 17, 1918, the Romanovs were awakened and told they were being relocated for their safety. Instead, they were taken to a basement. There, in a cramped room with peeling wallpaper and a single light bulb, the last Tsar of Russia and his family were executed. No trial, no ceremony, just a grim, final act to eliminate a royal dynasty that had ruled for more than 300 years. The shots echoed through the building, echoes that would haunt Russia for generations. To supporters, it was a necessary act to protect the revolution. To enemies, it was unforgivable murder. Either way, there was no turning back. The Civil War only grew darker from this moment. The war spread like wildfire. Cities changed hands multiple times. Villages were burned. Crops were seized by whichever army passed through. Hunger stalked the countryside like a silent predator. Disease spread. Families fled across frozen rivers, carrying only what they could hold. Both sides committed brutal acts in the name of victory. The Reds executed suspected counter-revolutionaries. The Whites slaughtered Bolshevik sympathizers. Peasants formed their own militias, fighting anyone who threatened their land. Everywhere, chaos reigned. Yet despite the overwhelming pressure, the Bolsheviks had one powerful advantage: unity of command. Trotsky's Red Army grew stronger. The Bolsheviks controlled key cities like Moscow and Petrograd, railway lines, industrial centers, and communication hubs. Gradually, the Whites lost ground. By 1920, the Red Army had pushed many white forces into retreat. Siberia, Ukraine, the Caucasus. One by one, territories fell back under Bolshevik control. In 1922, after 5 years of bloodshed, the Civil War finally sputtered to an exhausted end. Millions were dead. Cities were ruined. Families torn apart. Russia lay in ashes. But the Bolsheviks had won. From the ruin, Lenin and his party began to rebuild. They believed a new dawn was coming, one born not from monarchy or capitalism, but from revolution. Yet even as they celebrated victory, a shadow loomed behind Lenin's leadership, a shadow whose rise would shape the next chapter of Russia's destiny. His name was Joseph Stalin. The fire of civil war had burned away the old Russia. What rose from the ashes would be something entirely new and unimaginably powerful. Russia had changed, but the wounds of revolution were far from healed. Lenin and the Bolsheviks now sat at the center of power in Petrograd and Moscow, yet their hold over the old empire was only barely secure. Across the vast land, rival armies rose, loyal to Tsar's generals, foreign governments, nobles, and even rival socialist groups. Russia had not stepped into peace. It had stepped into a firestorm. And from this blaze emerged one of the bloodiest conflicts in modern history, the Russian Civil War. When word spread that the Bolsheviks had executed Tsar Nicholas II and his family in July 1918, the empire trembled. Many Russians who had remained silent during the revolutions now burned for revenge. Monarchists, conservatives, and ex-imperial officers rallied under the banner of the White Army, determined to restore the old order. To them, the Bolsheviks were destroyers, criminals who had shattered centuries of tradition. To the Bolsheviks, these whites were enemies of progress trying to drag Russia backward. Two visions of Russia collided, and there could be no compromise. At the center of the Bolshevik defense stood a man whose name would echo through history, Leon Trotsky. Appointed as Commissar of War, he created the Red Army, shaping it with steel discipline, strict ideology, and an unbreakable command structure. Trotsky traveled across fronts in a famous armored train, rallying exhausted fighters with fiery speeches that combined idealism with raw intimidation. He reinstated officers from the old Tsarist army, men who had experience but lacked loyalty. To ensure obedience, he assigned political commissars to every unit. Each commissar had a simple duty: make sure the officers obeyed the revolution or faced consequences. Under Trotsky, the Red Army became a terrifying weapon, ruthless, organized, and fanatically loyal. From 1918 to 1920, Russia was not a single war zone, but many wars occurring simultaneously. In the north, British and American forces landed, determined to stop Bolshevism from spreading. In Siberia, the Czech Legion, tens of thousands of former POWs, seized control of the Trans-Siberian Railway. In the south, General Denikin and his white forces marched toward Moscow with brutal determination. In the northwest, General Yudenich attempted to reclaim Petrograd. And far east, Admiral Kolchak declared himself a supreme ruler of Russia. The map of Russia looked like a shattered mirror, every shard warring with every other. The countryside suffered the most. Villages were burned, crops were confiscated, and civilians were caught between armies demanding loyalty. Famine haunted the land like a silent hunter. To secure their rule internally, the Bolsheviks unleashed the Chaika, a secret police force tasked with eliminating counter-revolutionaries. Across cities and towns, prisons overflowed as nobles, priests, merchants, and political rivals were arrested or executed. The Bolsheviks argued it was necessary for survival. Their enemies called it barbaric. Either way, the message was clear. The revolution would not tolerate dissent. And so began what history now calls the Red Terror, a period when ideology and fear merged into a single, powerful tool of control. Despite foreign support, superior funding, and experienced generals, the white forces suffered from a fatal weakness. They were divided. Each commander wanted to shape Russia in his own image. Their armies fought bravely, but they lacked unity, shared purpose, and the ability to inspire the common people, most of whom were peasants who feared a return to the old oppressive order. The Reds, though brutal, offered something clear and simple: land, bread, and peace. Even if imperfect, it was a promise that millions found easier to hope in Indiana. Trotsky's discipline, Lenin's political vision, and the Bolsheviks' ability to control industry and communication eventually tilted the balance. By late 1920, the white armies were defeated one after the other. Some fled abroad, others were captured, and some joined the Reds to survive. The foreign supporters withdrew. Villages buried their dead. Cities tried to rebuild. But the cost had been catastrophic. By the end of the Civil War, an estimated 8 to 10 million people had died, more from hunger and disease than combat. The economy was wrecked, railways destroyed, and fields abandoned. And yet, in the midst of all this ruin, the Bolsheviks emerged victorious. What they had won was not a peaceful nation, nor a united people. They had won power, unquestioned, centralized, and absolute. Russia had endured rebellion, war, hunger, and terror. But the revolution was not finished. A new struggle was coming, one that would define the very nature of the Soviet state. The smoke of the Civil War had barely cleared when Lenin and his closest comrades looked upon the ruins of their battered land. Russia was devastated, its railways shattered, its factories deserted, its people starving and exhausted. Villages whispered prayers for bread. Cities echoed the cries of orphans and widows. After years of revolution and war, Russia was not a nation. It was a wound. But from this wound, Lenin intended to build something new, something unprecedented, something the world had never seen: a worker state, a socialist empire, a nation reborn as the Soviet Union. By late 1920, the Bolsheviks had won the Civil War, but victory came with a harsh price. Hunger stalked the countryside. Inflation turned money into useless paper. Factories sat silent. The peasants, forced under war communism, hid grain from the state to survive. Workers fled cities in search of food. Lenin understood that without swift change, the revolution itself would collapse. And collapse it nearly did. In 1921, the Kronstadt sailors, once loyal heroes of the revolution, rose up in protest against Bolshevik rule. Their slogan was painful: Soviets without Bolsheviks. For Lenin, this rebellion was a sign more frightening than any white army. It meant the people themselves were turning against the revolution. With sorrow and resolve, he ordered the Red Army to crush the uprising. Cannons roared across the frozen Gulf of Finland, and the rebellion was drowned in blood. The revolution had survived, but only barely. Lenin knew something had to change. In response to the nationwide crisis, Lenin unveiled a surprising and controversial idea in 1921, the New Economic Policy, NEP. It allowed peasants to sell their surplus grain, small businesses to reopen, limited private trade, a partial return to a market economy. To many Bolsheviks, NEP felt like betrayal. They had fought years of brutal war to destroy capitalism. Why bring any part of it back? But Lenin was pragmatic. If we do not bend, he warned, we will break. The NEP worked. Slowly, villages regained life. Grain returned to markets. Workshops buzzed again. The country took its first breath in years. Though temporary, NEP stabilized the nation and restored hope to millions. For the first time since 1917, the revolution seemed capable of surviving. As Russia regained strength, Lenin set his sights on a bigger vision, uniting all the former imperial territories into a single socialist federation. In 1922, delegates from Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian republics gathered for a historic moment. After long debates, one agreement emerged: The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was born. It was not just a country. It was an ideological project, a symbol meant to show the world that a new kind of society was possible. The hammer and sickle rose as its emblem. The red flag became its banner, and Moscow stood at its heart. The Soviet Union was young, fragile, and filled with contradictions, but it represented the victory of the Bolshevik dream. Just as the new union took shape, the man who had led Russia through revolution and civil war fell seriously ill. Strokes left Lenin weak, isolated, and increasingly worried about what would come after him. He saw dangers on the horizon, especially in one man, Joseph Stalin, the Bolsheviks' general secretary. Stalin was quiet, calculating, and rapidly gathering power behind the scenes. Lenin attempted to warn the party in his final writings, urging them to reduce Stalin's power, but his voice was fading. On January 21st, 1924, Lenin died at age 53. Millions lined the streets to mourn. His body was eventually placed in a mausoleum on Red Square, where it remains to this day. Whether it's a tribute to a revolutionary or a relic of a troubled past is still debated. With Lenin gone, the struggle for leadership exploded. Trotsky, the brilliant architect of the Red Army, seemed the natural successor, but Stalin, through tactical alliances and bureaucratic maneuvering, outplayed him. By 1928, Stalin stood as the unchallenged leader of the Soviet Union. Under Stalin, NEP was dismantled. A new era of forced industrialization and collectivization began, changing the Soviet Union into a superpower, but at immense human cost. The revolution had entered a darker, harsher chapter, one shaped not by Lenin's ideals, but by Stalin's iron will. The Russian Revolution began as a cry for bread and dignity. It destroyed a 300-year-old monarchy, survived war and famine, and gave birth to a state that would dominate global politics for decades. It inspired movements across Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. It terrified Western governments. It reshaped the 20th century, but it also left scars, deep ones. Millions suffered in the chaos, terror, and authoritarian rule that followed. History remembers a revolution not as triumph or tragedy alone, but as both. A storm that toppled an empire, a fire that forged a new one, a moment when ordinary people changed the course of the world. And its echoes still shape our world today.